Chapter 4. The Prodigal Son. Part 1. The next morning. The next morning was not much different from any ordinary one. I awoke when my wife did and had breakfast with her and the kids. The new day came with almost no memory of the previous one, and why that was, I'm still not sure. Perhaps it was just because of the routine that came with each new morning that seemed to capture all focus. But what was even more peculiar was the fact that certain parts of the previous night were brought up selectively without any deeper thought. What I mean is that I still remembered the constable's instructions for me, and how I was to spend this day on light duty over in the archives. But there were no thoughts about why that was, what happened, or why this came about. In fact, I was even allowed to sleep in a bit since my normal duties had me waking up much earlier than I was able to this day. I got to enjoy breakfast with the family and even wake the kids up since I didn't have to organize morning muster with my detachment. I of course was asked why I got to sleep in and enjoy breakfast with the kids, but I only answered with what was true. The constable put me on light duty for the next few days so I can recover easier. That was good enough for my kids, and myself without any other thought, although I could tell it wasn't quite enough for my wife. My wife continued to go about her normal morning routine, thankful for the unordinary time she got to spend with me. But she continued to look at me as if something were troubling her. For most of the morning, I couldn't quite pinpoint what that was until at some random point in the middle of my last bite of breakfast, I remembered what I said to her before passing out. I still awoke with a clean wound and new wrapping, and she still smiled at me lovingly when she saw Joseph light up at the fact he got to come with me to work. Although it was there at the tail end of breakfast that I remembered what I told her last night, and finally understood the look she'd been giving me. I think the reason she stayed quiet about it that morning was perhaps because she chalked my words up to the amount of blood on my shirt when I showed up. It was easy for people to spout all kinds of incoherent or illogical words and responses after losing enough blood, and that must have been what she concluded in order to sleep last night. Still, the reason I chose those words was a mystery even to myself, and by the time I was done with breakfast, the whole memory of yesterday, and especially the night before, seemed like a strange dream. Because of that, I wasn't sure what I had to explain to my concerned wife, if anything. By the time Hannah was on her way out the door for school and Michelle heading for missionary prep, Joseph was rubbing it into them. Michelle kissed my cheek on the way out, Hannah kept her head down, and with Joseph hopping up and down in place beside me, my wife was staring at me with a face that told me the falseness of my conclusions regarding last night. No, whatever happened last night was not a dream, and you owe your wife a better explanation. Soon, I saw this look, saw the images of last night flash before my mind, and one last time I tried to convince myself there was nothing to it before there was a knock on the door. When I turned and opened the door, Mr. Duncan Schmidt was standing there in his complete uniform, stepped into the frame of the door, and hit me over the head with some reality from last night. The young guardsman Proby stood in the doorway with the words, "Hey, Mrs. Young, Lieutenant Young. Doyle had me check up on the burned man. He's doing well, I think. He's still unconscious, but he looks fine. Looks kinda like a mummy with all the wrapping Doc Franklin did. Anyway, the constable's having me follow you today, since he said you'd need a hand after bleeding like a faucet last night, so I'm all yours today. I guess." I greeted the man subtly. "Hello to you as well, Mr. Schmidt, although your presence isn't required." "I'm fine." The bleeding stopped before it began. Duncan only adjusted the rifle slung over his shoulder and said, "Yeah, the constable said you'd refuse my help, but orders are orders, so you got me for the whole day." An uncomfortable moment lingered after that, especially with the supreme lack of subtlety the young man vocalized about my prior condition before my family. There, I began feeling even more unspoken questions from my wife, and saw Joseph looking at my abdomen wondering where the blood was. Seeing his dad was all right, the moment ended, and Joseph immediately turned back to Mr. Schmidt as the guardsman went on, as if he hadn't just created an uncomfortable moment. "Hey kiddo, didn't see you down there. Are you staying out of trouble?" Joseph immediately began pummeling Duncan's legs. I met my wife's eyes, and inaudibly promised her right there, "We'll talk tonight." She nodded, greeted Mr. Schmidt in her usual warm way, and bid me farewell with a kiss on my cheek before leaving with my son and Mr. Schmidt for the new Canaan Town Museum. The walk there was a brief one. Thoughts of the previous night were buried by the idea of getting to spend this day with my son and the new young guardsman I'd been meaning to spend more time with. Along the way, I heard from Duncan that my detachment was working with Doyle for the day and was sending their well wishes. Thinking about my men made me feel warm, but thinking about them made me recall my only complaint. That being how I wished Joseph was to join my side while I was with them. John, Carl, Ramos, and Nathan all loved Joseph, and Joseph really enjoyed playing around with them at community gatherings. Almost all the men of the guard knew Joseph and my family, and I thought back to all the times my men got to spend with them at the most wonderful gatherings or celebrations in New Canaan. Hearing Joseph talking away with Duncan as they trailed me, I began thinking of all the faces my boy wouldn't see again at the next community night. Gavin Salazar, Roy Sutton, Axel and Dennis Gates, Diego Marquez, Rowan Tomlinson, and of course Evan Buller. I've commanded, led, and lost many men over the years since earning my place as a lieutenant of the guard, but it was just those 7 names that I knew Joseph would never get to see again after that fateful day over a month ago. Thinking about this, I felt my abdomen, placed a hand under my vest, and was relieved that it came out dry. Feeling relieved about my wound, I was then greeted by the Wolin couple before I could think anymore about the injury or the men I lost. I greeted the Wolins, congratulated them on their recent marriage, and apologized for not being able to make it, and they wished me well, remarking at how nice it was to see me walking the streets and not atop one of the towers. Before I could explain, I was greeted by the next passers-by, who I again hadn't the chance to see or interact with too often due to my duties. The whole walk was like this. It wasn't often that I was seen walking the town in the late morning, and I couldn't quite express how nice it was to walk the town and not be on an urgent mission. Duncan commented on how I could possibly know everyone we passed as Joseph hopped along shouting, "Duncan, look at me!" as the young man ignored. I could only tell the young man that once you're in this place long enough, everyone knows one another, and emphasizing how it is only because of Christ that our community is so tight-knit. He could only respond with, "Huh." I figured as much. Never had much of a family of my own growing up out there in the wild. Clearly with his attention divided between following me and acknowledging the boy still demanding recognition for how far he can jump along the street. As we drew nearer to the town square and rounded the last buildings before the museum across from the temple, the streets, homes, and shop fronts were more and more crowded. It eventually became impossible to address everyone who wished us good morning and commented on how unusual it was to see me not on official duty, and I replied to Mr. Schmidt through the chatter of so many people. "I know your baptism's coming up, but I hope you already know that you're part of the New Canaan family." Holding Joseph by the collar so he wouldn't get lost in the crowd or run off somewhere, Duncan stuck right behind me as we moved through the busy streets. "Next week, I'm pretty sure. I guess that'll make it official. If you want to put it that way, I suppose you can. Everyone here is a part of the body of Christ. We are all family. And once you've confessed your faith in him, you can take that as your formal admission into..." Duncan was already well known in the guard, and was surprised constantly by the people of town who seemed to know all about him despite never meeting them. In fact, it was after I said this that Duncan's hand was grabbed by an older man, and was told how good a job he was doing. Duncan thanked the man and struggled to keep up with me, pulling Joseph along with him as he recovered and replied to me. "I thought I'd already done that plenty of times with you all. I sorta wish I didn't have to get dunked underwater in front of the whole town when Doyle said they had a perfectly good mud puddle behind his home. I've baptized tribals, and even some new Canaanites in similar places when there wasn't anything more formal available, or when a new believer didn't want to wait till the next baptism day at the temple." Either way, I knew he couldn't see it, but I was all grinning as I said to him, "We gave you that chance months ago. You're locked in with the temple ceremony now. And don't worry, Doyle, Hudson, Ray, Nathan, John, and I. Promise to cry loud tears of joy and make a terrible scene when you're up at the altar with Mordecai." "Can't wait," said Duncan dryly as the 3 of us stepped onto the shaded platform in front of the row of buildings across from the temple. The town square was busy off to our left, but most of the foot traffic was around the streets or buildings surrounding the square. Other than a few of the men in deacon attire or robes of the choir, the steps or area around the temple itself was scarcely populated. I thought I saw the robes of one of the elders, but he was too far for me to discern. Before too long, I looked up at the signs hanging from the awning beams, and there we were. The Museum of New Canaan was a dusty little place in the dead center of that row of buildings across from the temple. Built within the ruins of a concrete structure this whole block was made from, the place had been completely refurbished over so many years since the bombs. The walls were completely paneled in wood, and the giant windows at the front of the place let in more than enough light, regardless of the hour of day. Nobody really entered the museum since most New Canaanites had learned everything they needed to know about the history of their community in school, and even though this place used to serve as the town hall of sorts, it was obvious that nobody really entered this place too frequently. This was made even more apparent when we entered to the chime of a bell, and after a brief survey of the rows of shelves, my eyes landed on a woman behind a short wooden counter who was in the middle of shaking herself out of a daydream at our entry. It wasn't too often that I got to see Mrs. Hollenbeck, and if she wasn't a member of the women's group my wife was part of, I never would have known she worked at the museum. When she was sure she was present, a large smile grew across her face as she greeted me, Joseph, and even Duncan. Duncan again marveled at how she could know who he was despite never meeting, but after a short exchange in pleasantries, Mrs. Hollenbeck said she wasn't expecting anyone other than Deacon Mathers today. I told her the short of why I was joining the deacon today, and she said she'd pray for my recovery before telling me that the deacon was downstairs in the official archive storage. I asked in passing if she knew why he was down there so frequently, and she said that her guess was as good as mine. I mentioned casually that I caught word that he was helping some of the elders in a potential effort to expand the community, and she thought that was a marvelous idea. Still, the two of us weren't entirely sure how much of this research into history was needed for such an event. As the thoughts from last night crept into my mind, I decided to keep his fascination with the abandoned home of Judah Black to myself. In the end, she motioned us past the wall to her right, saying we could find the stairwell to the archives just past the bathrooms. I parted ways with Mrs. Hollenbeck, taking my son and the young guardsman with me. Following the wood-lined wall and passing a few rows of shelves laden with books and items from our community's history, we passed the bathrooms and found the stairs near the back of the building. I wondered what was upstairs, but the thought left me as I took my two followers down one flight before pushing open the only steel door in the old building marked archives. Upon entering, the place certainly had a unique feel to it. The smell of old paper flooded our nostrils, and it appeared as though the reconstruction of this part of the building was all but ignored. Unlike the charming and homely aesthetic of the museum above, the basement archives was a place with nearly 36 rows of tall shelves, chipping paint and water-stained walls, and only a few dim fluorescent lights flickering on the ceiling. There at the far end, the man at a desk surrounded with stacks of papers lifted his head at our arrival, showing it to, of course, be the Deacon Mathers. Even from a distance, I could see his smile, and I approached with my son and, helping hand in tow. There truly wasn't much to say about how this day went. It wasn't what I expected, and as I helped the deacon by gathering papers from the labeled shelves, I was admittedly more bored than I ever thought possible. The deacon and I exchanged a few words here and there, but nothing about the previous night or the stranger. For whatever reason, I tried not to think about last night, and again tried my absolute best to forget the conclusion I landed on regarding the stranger's identity. What was even stranger was how Mr. Mathers, too, never brought up the prior evening. But in fairness, it appeared he was too busy focusing on the documents I fetched, or the ones he was already buried in before our arrival. Other than the words we exchanged regarding the amount of blood I lost last night, and my overall well-being, Mr. Mathers acted almost as if the night didn't happen. I was kept more idle than I thought I would be, and Mr. Mathers would only reiterate that my presence was only out of order to the constable. Because he didn't really need me to be there, he even offered to let me walk the town, spend my day in the museum, etc. I took him up on some of that every now and then, taking Joseph and Duncan outside into the town square for a few minutes at a time. However, before going too far, or deciding I might as well just spend the day at home and send word to the constable later, there was something inside that prevented me from doing that. Regardless of how bored I was, how much the fluorescent lights made my head hurt, or how unnecessary I was for the deacon's quiet work, I was still drawn back to that basement again and again after each short break. As miserable and unnecessary as I was, I felt even worse for Duncan and Joseph. Since arrival in the basement, I was almost constantly having to tell Joseph that this wasn't what his dad did for work every day. I trusted Duncan to back me up on that, but he was almost too brain-dead to reply to anything. Duncan certainly wasn't needed to help me for anything today, but the constable's orders were his orders, and even though the young man was better fit for scouting the wastes, patrolling the market, or even just running messages across town, he was stuck with me, and I couldn't apologize enough. The poor boy Duncan just sat on that probably lice-ridden, ugly old couch beside the door next to Joseph. Joseph was lucky enough to be a kid who could amuse himself with a string if he had to, and he certainly had to today. I remember it was probably around 3 hours into the basement prison sentence when I looked at Duncan sitting on that couch like a corpse that hadn't moved since our last walk upstairs 20 minutes prior. Remembering our earlier conversation, I thought of how unfortunate it was that Duncan was about to die before his baptism. I don't think either of us would have thought that it was going to be boredom that would do it. Seeing Joseph still whining but at least busy tying his fingers with that string, I looked back to the deacon who sat ever silent and ever reading the stack of papers in front of him. Watching his eyes going from line to line, I realized I had only ever helped him about 3 times in the past 3 hours, and began thinking about the most recent file box I fetched. It was at this point that curiosity and boredom got the better of me, so I asked, "What exactly are you doing this research for? I can't imagine the elders were just trying to get rid of you for a few days." The man raised his face as his mouth went from serious focus to its usual friendliness as he met my eyes. "I'm sorry you're bored, Paul. I know this isn't the most exciting thing for you to do, and I apologize for not needing more assistance from you. Personally, I didn't feel an apology was necessary, but before I could say anything, he went on, although you're right, the elders aren't trying to get rid of me for a while. They would have sent me on mission if that was their intention." He watched his joke have its intended effect on my face as he, at last, gave some explanation for his work in this dark basement. The elders expect the future of New Canaan to be bright like we discussed yesterday afternoon. However, you were right. We know that is no easy endeavor with all the threats around us, but my research here is simply to be able to offer my input into the way we achieve that hopeful future. Here in the archives, I'm hoping to have history at my back when I arrive at the next meeting series and offer my input. You see, I recognize that I am new to this community, and even new to faith if you account for my whole life. Since the people are trusting me to help lead them, I just want to be fully aware of everything you all have endured. Does that make sense? I thought about it, and it did make sense. The deacon constantly showed me how true his intentions were, and it was moments like this and countless others that made me know that if there was any fruit of the spirit he encapsulated, it was his faithfulness to us and everything we are. With this in mind, I replied to the man with my thoughts on his last statement. Fully aware of all we endured, I could only chuckle in strange but sincere admiration. That'd make you one of the few. I don't think most New Canaanites know all we endured, myself included, but your dedication to us continues to impress me. The deacon nearly blushed. It's only you, the constable, and Christ I have to thank for when you spared me that day and brought me here. I know I don't owe you, him, the elders, Mordecai, or Christ for what you all did, but I'll still offer my best. Before I could say anything, I watched his eyebrows raise, and a shocked expression consumed his face as he asked, "What time is it?" I glanced down at my watch and said, "About 12 and some change." Immediately, he stood from the desk and began stacking the papers, placing his bookmarks where they were needed, and preparing to urgently depart, saying, "Speaking of the meeting series, I need to be there at 12:30, and I have to show up early if I'm going to let Elder Harlan know about your security suggestions." He went to throw on his jacket, and internally I appreciated the fact that he remembered what I said regarding Duncan's report. As the man sped up his readying, I glanced over at Duncan and Mr. Mathers said aloud, "Constable Hanshaw should be there as well, so I'll be sure to ask him about having you do something else, since you and your boys are so bored." I was going to thank him, but couldn't get a word in as he stuffed a few folders marked important into his satchel and left me with, "One last thing, while I'm away, could you find the file box marked BR-346-22-BBPC? Should be row 32 about halfway down or so. I gotta run, but I will go through it when I get back. See you in about an hour and a half." At that, the deacon departed, blowing past the shelves of this dim basement. The urgency of his departure did little to stir Mr. Schmidt from his vegetative state, but I was able to let out a "you got it" before the door shut behind Mr. Mathers. Seeing how sad and idle my son and the young guardsmen were, I decided with Mr. Mather's departure to carry out his instruction, and then immediately take the two out to stretch their legs or to get some lunch. Getting up, I walked to the row of shelves marked 32 and strolled down, reading the labels on the shelves and looking over the dusty old boxes that hadn't been touched in probably years. The lights above didn't reach this far into the depths of the shelves, but around halfway, I pulled up my flashlight and, to my surprise, the one marked BR-346-22-BBPC was the first one I saw at eye level. I didn't even bother to try to figure out what the numbers or letters stood for as I hoisted the heavy box off the shelf and returned to the light. With the heavy box in hand, I moved to the deacon's side of the desk and couldn't find a good place to set it amidst the paper stacks. I decided to place it beside the desk on the ground, and there it sat as a footstool as I collected my breath from carrying it. I remembered the constable said not to move heavy objects last night, but I shrugged any more thought of that out of my mind when my hand revealed nothing but dry shirt under my vest. I was just fine and left alone amidst the deacon's messy desk. It didn't take more than a brief glance for me to immediately know that I wouldn't understand all the papers the deacon was going through. It all looked like a bunch of old letters, lists of names and diary entries. I recognized a few of the last names on the lists, because their descendants were still alive in the present day, but I couldn't make heads or tails about what the deacon was trying to discern from. Miss Anna Mavis, who was writing to her sister about how nice her first mission was going back in 2224. I finally concluded that the deacon's affairs were his own, and there was no use going through all the ancient documents on the desk. Upon seeing the bored faces across the room I could help remedy, I went to stand when I halted mid-rise and remembered Mr. Mather's most recent fascination, and the conversation I had with him yesterday afternoon as the sun was setting. There I heard the voice and felt the eyes of that burned man enter my mind, Judah Black, before I could begin to think about and worry about the man from last night, who he could be, who I internally knew he was, and all the oddities from the past 2 days. I briefly scanned over the desk and the name of Judah Black did not stick out on any of the papers. At that, I wanted to rise and take the two across the room out to lunch, but I couldn't. As much as I wanted to stand, I instead felt my hands drifting to the box I had just pulled from the shelves and was using as a footstool. Completely unconscious, I removed the first paper in the file box, and before I could wonder why I wasn't taking my son and Duncan out to lunch, my heart had stopped when my eyes read the reason for the box's label. Beginning record, March 46, 2200. Bishop Black personal correspondence. Below the heading immediately started with a letter I couldn't not read. It was proof from the past of what truly happened last night, and proof that I couldn't deny a second longer. March 6, 2246. From Bishop Judah Black, spiritual leader of the community of New Canaan and leader of the Mormon unification with the followers of Christ. 2. Mrs. Sandra Martin of the Followers of the Apocalypse Organization of California. Regarding our last correspondence, I must insist that you send your missionaries to the community of New Canaan first, before we can organize any mutual effort to assist the tribes of the South. As noble as your mission and goals are, I'm afraid I wasn't quite clear in my last letter when I say that we harbor similar ambitions arrived at by different means. To clarify my previous message with your latest response, it is only the why that serves as the primary factor in our hesitation to lead a joint effort. Our community is a community of faith. We live by faith in our Lord and our faith in Him alone. To proceed without our Lord at the heart of any expedition is something I cannot willfully permit. Now I understand your organization has had poor experiences with religions out in California, and stories of this supposed master you've described make me saddened that there could possibly be any confusion between the Lord we've served for thousands of years and this abominable creature of recent decades. As I have said previously, we do not consider ourselves a religion by any sense of traditional understanding, as we see the how we live and what we do as a way of life or relationship that only comes with knowledge of who our Lord is. I digress, but the finer points of who we are and how we live is of discussion for a later and hopefully more personal occasion. With this in mind, I must again emphasize my suggestion that you send your people to our community for initial outreach, so that you may see who we are, know who we serve, and understand the importance of our work that is only done in our Lord's name alone. However, as it should please you, I will continue to bring up the idea of mutual cooperation with your organization at our next series of meetings with the elders. It was obvious that some of the letters received and sent were gone or disappeared in time, but the archive continued with the next one still addressed to this person from California. Before I could begin to wonder how the previous elders and bishop could communicate with people from so far away, after we've been isolated in the wilderness for nearly decades, I was already reading the next letter. September 12, 2246. From Bishop Judah Black, spiritual leader of the community of New Canaan, to Mrs. Sandra Martin of the Followers of the Apocalypse Organization of California. I must admit that I was not expecting a response so soon. From the sounds of things and considering the growth of the NCR, it may not be more than a few years before California and Utah are touching borders, and perhaps a formal meeting between us becomes possible. Considering the time frame you sent me in our last exchange, I am delighted to read your acceptance and understanding of our spiritual intentions. I agree that coming to some form of middle ground is the best course of action, and we look forward to receiving your representatives after the success of your proposition. Yes, you have read that correctly. We will accept and honor our end of your relations proposal. After much deliberation with the elders, I have agreed to send one of my best to link up with your missionaries at the 1589th location by the end of the first week of November 2246. The man I'm sending is aware of your organization and its mission as well, and is eager to serve as a bridge of understanding between our two groups. He is fully aware of the men you are sending, this Mr. Calhoun and Mr. Sallow, and is looking forward to meeting them and assisting in this joint work. Regarding the person I'm dispatching, it should be known that this man and his importance to me personally is a gesture of great trust and a sign of how seriously I'm taking your offer of cooperation. The translator who will meet with your missionaries and assist in communication with the tribes of the Grand Canyon region is none other than my very own adopted son. Unable to have children due to my wife's unfortunate end, the young man I've dispatched was adopted from two parents in the community that unfortunately saw their ends doing their missionary duties in the war-torn wilderness of Utah. Since the passing of his two parents when he was but 2 years old, I had taken him and raised him, and loved him as he were my very own. With this, you can inform your missionaries that the name of the man they are to meet with is Joshua Graham. Left with his parents' name, he is still my son, and his presence on this expedition into uncharted Arizona should again emphasize my trust in the men you've selected, and a sign of my personal hope for future cooperation with your organization. Please bear in mind that I do not speak so highly of the man I'm sending due to paternal instinct. Although he may lack experience with the tribal world as some of the other missionaries of God, he is experienced enough with the wilderness and nature of the tribes to act as more than a blessing and guide for your men who may not understand the gravity of the tribal world outside of California. To quell any potential concerns on your end regarding the man I selected, I will illuminate the remainder of my selection's attributes here. Joshua has just returned from his first mission, is already eager to set out again, and was blessed from a young age with a gift of comprehension for linguistical learning that he's only perfected over the years under my care and tutelage. He is my best translator, and despite no new Canaanite ever traveling beyond the old world borders of southern Utah, he is more familiar with the southern dialects and variations than anyone else I have at my disposal. Even though he may not be able to speak the languages of the tribes your team is expected to encounter verbatim, bear in mind that this expedition, for the pursuit of knowledge, is what brought your inquiry to my attention in the first place. Rest assured, my son's well aware of possible variations in regional communication, but his understanding of the southernmost border region language should be more than enough to ensure the success of your men and their mission of outreach. There was more to the letter above on the next page, but I couldn't read anymore when my peripherals caught the heading of the next letter, and how it wasn't from the California woman or Judah Black. Just like before, it was clear that a number of the letters exchanged between Judah and the woman weren't present in the archive, but the name atop the next letter completely captured my attention, and my thoughts again went to the previous night as my eyes read.
November 2nd, 2246. From Joshua, to Bishop Black and the Community of Faith. You all know I am not much for writing in letters, but I know Elder Parnell and Bishop Black are expecting a letter when I have made contact with the followers' missionaries. Exactly where the instructions told me I would, I found the two men, Mr. Calhoun and Mr. Sallow. I was blessed to have departed when I did, since the two men had only arrived less than 24 hours before I did, and great first impressions were seemingly made. I know I will have more to say, and I will keep all of you up to date on the status of this expedition when I have more to say, but please don't expect to hear from me too regularly, as I will be busy offering my services to these men and doing what I can to further the work I've been entrusted to do. I don't have much more time to write, since the followers' men appear eager to set out as soon as possible. I'm leaving this letter with Dunn and Foster from the Guard after they have assured my arrival and successful meetup with the FOA missionaries. I will quickly note that my escorts have done very well in their duties, and I will be praying for their successful and safe return home in the coming weeks. I'll reiterate the fact once more that you all cannot expect to hear from me too often once my work has begun. Still, to quell any worries, I'll be sure to send another update on my well-being when me and these FOA men have made contact with their first tribe, and I can establish some means of contacting you all once more. Please do not worry about me for any lack of regular communication, so all I can ask is that you pray for me and these secular men that I may do my part for the kingdom and serve the Lord well on this trip. I am in excellent hands, his hands, the best hands, so continue to pray for me. I love you all, and you will hear from me soon. I promise.
Nothing was in between this one and the next one. The images and experiences from last night ran through my mind still as the next letter went on.
January 9th, 2247, I think. From Joshua. To Bishop Black and the Community of Faith. It has already been months since I set out with these men, and we have had contact with a number of the tribes inhabiting the canyon region. Mostly war parties and too many close calls to count. Bill and Edward are already thinking this cause is fruitless, since all the people we've come across have been more inclined to shoot at us than speak. I'm reminded of the tribes of the West GSL, for our allies out here are few if any. As you may have guessed, the expedition has been rough on myself as well as my new friends, but even though their hope remains a dying fire, I have fortunately been blessed enough to serve as a light in the darkness and chaos around us. Just when all seemed lost and Edward suggested we turn around, my prayers were answered when I encountered a few friends out here. Here in the lands marking the borders of the Kaibab and Kalatsakala territory, in the middle of a land plagued by creatures and warfare, the three of us happened across a group of hunters from my friends in the Cochinelli tribe. I was just as surprised as you are to hear of, or let alone see them so far south. The friends were a long way from home, but were able to give Mr. Calhoun the location of the Blackfoots, the Cochinelli just finished trading with. It is thanks to Matartha Chinakacho of the Cochinelli that we have our way forward, and you are receiving this message from me, where he said he would deliver it to his runners upon successful return to his home. If Elijah Brinley gets the chance to see this message and his friends in the Cochinelli, please tell his friend Matartha again how grateful I am for his help, as thankful as I am to have seen some friends of our God in these terrifying wastes, and as much as I wish I could end this message on a positive note, I have to admit that I am worried about Bill and Edward's new plan to seek out the Blackfoots. They are one tribe that has not made these lands any safer, but I remain hopeful that my new connection to the Cochinelli and ability to communicate my party's intentions will be more than enough to do what I've been sent here to do. I can only ask for more prayers from anyone reading this, and once more assure you that I am in the best of hands out here regardless of what happens.
With no ability to reply to the young man beyond the known wilderness of Utah, no reply was possible from Judah or the community of faith that followed his brave actions from so far. The next letter picks up much later, and read unlike the tone of a young man who is eager but nervous about his part in the expedition. As I read the next letter, I couldn't help but see the face illuminated in the campfire last night, and how desperate it was as it stared back at me. The young boy had clearly lost something that neither I nor he at the time could likely discern. I knew this in my gut, and I think the young man did too as it read.
April 2247. From Joshua Graham. To Judah Black and the Community of Faith. There's not much to say, I don't think. All I can hope for by writing this letter is that you call off any search expedition you may have sent for me. I am fine. I don't know if it was what I said to them, how I said it, or if I mixed up some words that might have meant something entirely different to the Kalatsakala, 50 miles north. But the Blackfoots did not welcome us, despite our peaceful intentions. We were taken prisoner by them not much longer after first sit down, and the three of us served as their prisoners for the past 3 or so months, I think. I remain uncertain of what the date is now, but with the winds of night becoming less and less cold, I can only assume it's around April. You may wonder how I'm writing this, or more importantly, how you're receiving this. The only answer is that I am still a prisoner, but with a much longer leash now. I would thank the grace of God for my freedom, but the truth is that would be ignoring the large part that the man and friend I call Edward played in this. Since I met him, Edward has proven to be one of the smartest men I've ever met. He has an almost encyclopedic knowledge of just about anything you could ask him. But during our time in captivity, he has shown a great knowledge of history and warfare from the old world. I only mention this because it was through his knowledge and my ability to communicate that I managed to negotiate our release with our captors. I'm somewhat ashamed to admit, but our end of the deal has Edward training the Blackfoot's warriors for their fight against the enemies that surround them and us by extension. Of course, I am here to translate for him, while Bill has largely been keeping himself out of the situation altogether. I don't know if what I am doing is the right thing, or if it is the wrong thing, but Edward at least appears to be right. These people, my captors, the Blackfoots, won't survive with all the enemies drawing closer and closer to their villages. So I see the necessity in this new arrangement. I am certain that some of you will have some misgivings about this, but know that I share them as well, and the situation here is completely out of my hands. It all seems so hard to adequately describe in any way you all can understand unless you were here. I don't know if I'm attempting to justify this, but I see the survival of this tribe as a way to afford them more time to find Christ. I have by no means abandoned my original purpose with these California men, or the lost of this region. Please pray for us and myself in the coming days. Edward speaks of marching on the ridges soon, so prayers for those who will surely perish before coming to our Lord is all I can ask of you. I just need more time. Time to save this tribe and these 2 friends of mine.
The desperate face from last night faded away as I read on, showing to me that what was said above was just the start of a downward spiral, as my mind remembered the skinless face that was so transfixed on the flame. The light in those blue eyes too faded into the darkness, and the faint sounds of that scream in pain ran in the back of my mind as I read the next one.
May or April, 2247. From Joshua Graham. To Judah Black and the Community of Faith. I have no way of knowing if you received my last letter, but I can only hope that those scouts gave the message to the proper parties in the Cochinelli. I recognize that they were likely killed crossing through Kalatsakala territory, but here I remain with the Blackfoots. My captivity may be news to you if my last message was not received, but neither I nor Edward nor Bill are their prisoners anymore. Although the cause for my true freedom is by no means a cause for celebration. What we did, what I allowed to happen to the Ridgers, I don't believe I will ever be able to forgive myself. I argued with Edward every night leading up to it when I heard what he was planning, but in the end, I can't tell if it was his convincing me, or it was my submission that allowed it to happen. In the end, I still gave the order, and I can't even express how sorry I am. I know there's no context for you all to understand what I did, but please pray for me. I've been repenting and begging for forgiveness every night, but there were so many dead and it's all my fault. I should have stopped Edward or ordered something else, but it's too late now. As terrible as all this has been, there remains a part of me that sees the horrendous logic behind it all. So much has happened in the weeks and months spent in captivity, and still, there is no way for my words to do justice. The wilderness around New Canaan isn't like the wilderness of this region. There is no light emanating from the temple anywhere to be seen here. All we can see, all I can see is the fires of war. One enemy after another, we're already on to the next one, and I follow as if my actions are not my own. Locked in thought, my body does while my mind sits in judgment after the fact, and I see no way out. Since the start of this expedition, there have been enemies around us in every direction, each as vile as the other, if not more. The only difference I see now in the brief moments of clarity each day is that neither Edward nor I are running from them anymore. Now he wears the crown of a war chief, and I stand beside him, unable to go anywhere else so long as there are enemies he's marching them towards. There's more death to come, but how I can do my work, my true work, is so far away that I can't see it.
The letter continued on the next page, with the pause appearing as though the writer picked up writing it sometime a few days, or perhaps even hours later. All it said was,
"The Kaibobs decided to join us."
I was left in awe, wondering what happened out there so long ago, and remembering the odd stories I heard growing up. I was still so young at the time that all this happened, but I've been with the Guard long enough to hear the stories and tales surrounding this man we were all warned about. I wondered where it all went wrong, how such a remorseful-sounding man with so much internal conflict could ride the wave started by Edward Sallow, or the man calling himself Caesar in the present day. How a young translator and preacher of the gospel remained unable to escape for so long came as a shock to everyone who heard of him, the truth of his origin, and considered the mystery of where his soul was for so long. Even in the letters, that mystery remained just that as I continued on, understanding so much more yet so little when I tried to delve deeper into a mind that became the worst in his inescapable circumstance. Chapter 5. The Prodigal Son, Part 2. The whole world seemed to completely freeze as I read letter after letter there in that basement of the new Canaan Museum. Going through the records of a dead man was never something I imagined myself doing. I didn't even really enjoy reading or writing. Of course, I could do it, but at that time, the fact remained hovering in the back of my mind. Why did this take priority over what I could be doing with my son and Duncan? The Deacon Mathers was still gone. I had already lost track of time and had no idea how long I had been reading as memories of the previous night ran through my mind while my eyes read on. The next letter was without context for such a spiritual transition or abandonment. The previous letter from the young Joshua Graham expressed such terrible guilt and regret for what he had done to the Blackfoot tribe's first enemies under his friend Edward. However, it was that last part, and his brief yet sorrowful explanation of the logic behind what he was blindly marching into, paired with what my present self already knew about the man, that made me understand, even just in part, why those eyes looked at me the way they did when he was beside the flame. The next letter began, and it was obviously during a time when he had established some kind of formal contact with New Canaan, while he was still a young man, and long after his sorrowful understanding from the previous letter began to fade while Edward marched the Blackfoots against more and more of their enemies. The words began like a man who had gone through far too much and was in something too deep to come back from, while the tone and word choice came off as a frustrated youth who couldn't adequately explain why he was doing the things he was doing out there in the world. The young man in the letter seemed to know what he was doing, knew who he already turned his back on, and decided to keep going for his sole focus on one mission he had to convince himself, and others was the right course. It was from a man who was obsessed, attempting to justify his addiction, but still refusing to acknowledge there was an issue in the first place.
May 20th, 2251. From Joshua Graham to Judah Black and the Community of Faith. I apologize that you fail to understand the reasons for my refusal to return. I believe I made my statements and reasoning quite discernible and put much time in their portrayal that I could have spent furthering my mission and God's mission. Now I understand that some of my points about Rome being the secular, sinful vessel to explode Christ's message across the world may have been a means of outrage amongst you, the elders, and the community as a whole. However, I must stand by what I've said, and again refuse your requests for me to return. Out here, I have found my true calling, the calling of unification, and it is a calling I cannot run from. I have neither the ability nor the will to do so now. I understand some of you have heard the occasional story about Edward and I's confederation of tribes, but I know you understand the tribal propensity toward embellishment. While the details may be trivial or outright false, the fact of the matter is that what Edward and I are creating, what we are doing, is good. I remain sorrowful that you all feel otherwise, but I can only reiterate what I have said constantly in my infrequent letters. That being, nothing I say can describe the nightmare of warfare that is the northern Arizona wilderness. With that said, I will answer the question you and the elders have sent me again and again with another question. How do you intend for me to preach the word or good news of our Lord Jesus Christ to men who speak no other language than the one of violence and annihilation? Dying for Christ only matters if those who witness your death have the ability to comprehend who or what exactly you're dying for. No, Edward is right. The tribes of this land understand nothing but destruction. It is only when the spirit to fight against what they know is best for them has been crushed out of existence and they are absorbed into our creation, embodying commonality or unification, that those who our Lord has spared even have a chance at beginning to understand complex thoughts, like who God is and how he should not be defied. Today I serve as an instrument of reward for the sin, barbarism, and horrendous world the people of this land have built for themselves in the decades after the Holocaust. When Joshua led the Israelites into the lands of Canaan, one by one, the city of Jericho to the kingdoms of Hazor fell to the armies of God and showed the world the brutality of his wrath upon the ones who deny what is God's. Rest assured, I still intend to save all who I can. My mission has not ended despite what some of you or the elders are undoubtedly believing. However, in order for that to happen, this land must first be unified and given the opportunity for some semblance of peace to even take root before such a return to our Lord is even a concept to the ones under our new banner. If anyone, Bishop Black or any of the elders want to help in any legitimate means, then you should continue to pray for the souls of the warriors we've lost, the ones who will fall in our next battle, and the enemies we face. Pray especially for the latter. Those who defy what Edward and I are building know not what they do and will unfortunately carry their sin or ignorance into the grave. But above all, pray for peace. With the help of the Lord, I only fight for peace. And I'm sorry so many of you continuously fail to understand that.
It was all starting to make sense now, and with the reading of that letter, I understood where the man's mind was. I could see in his handwriting how neat and precise it was, that he no longer had any reservation about what he was originally dragged into. The strangest, and possibly most frightening thing for me, was how much I understood his intentions. I have no way of knowing what the wastes of northern Arizona were like at that time, but to a boy who lost his parents at such a young age to tribal wars of the Utah wastes, it made sense to me. I thought back to the face of Evan Buller, the concerns I expressed to the deacon, and how shocked I was at the elders' plans for expansion into a world that understood nothing but destruction. Even in the present day, I knew the enemies around New Canaan bore little difference to the ones Joshua was leading in battle. But there I began to wonder why this city surrounded by so much darkness was different from the young man with the fire of God, who found himself in a similar position. He, just like us, were alone out here in the dark and blood-soaked wastes. I began to wonder why we had so many allies, why we were the ones who managed to break through to some of the worst tribes out there while the young man was not. I don't know if he tried different approaches over the years during the time frames between the letters, or if he was always fixated on the violent approach sometime after his initial regrets about the Ridgers. All I knew is that his approach showed all signs of working how he was planning. I thought back to everything I knew about that enemy beyond the known wilderness to the south and east. That monstrosity of Joshua and Edward's creation proved to be an unstoppable force, consuming, from what the stories have said, all of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and even the border regions of eastern Utah. Even once it became known to us that our stray missionary took up the title of legate, and his friend Edward crowned himself Caesar and created Caesar's legion. The work of unification he espoused in the letter above was not completed. Believing his work to be his own interpretation of Joshua's conquest of Canaan, I could understand his thought process and again began to wonder why we haven't taken on a more Old Testament approach to the enemies around us. There I began to understand even further what must have been going through his mind. Sometimes, and I've even felt it recently when I'm reminded of what happened to men like Evan Buller. but I am reminded of how it is sometimes far too difficult to see Christ through the storm around us. What can you do when you know He's there, but you cannot feel Him or see Him? You have faith that you will come out the other side of it one way or another, whether the bullets hit you or not, but that doesn't mean some people won't quit fighting. I would be lying if I said there weren't times I couldn't feel Him with me in the moment, but I knew He was there, and I fought and swam and shot and tried with everything in me to make it through, just for the smoke to clear, the clouds to part, the rain to stop, and reveal His face once again. The wounds on my body and the sight of so many dead would bring me to my knees again and again, and there I could see Him once more. I see the Lord staring down at me after such a terrible hardship, proving He was there the whole time, knowing what I should have done, and calming me with the knowledge that all my efforts just exhausted me more than it should have, since I already had the faith He sat behind the clouds in control of everything. Just like Peter, who began to sink when he saw the water and forgot who was in front of him. He didn't have to try so hard. I didn't have to try so hard. Joshua didn't have to try so hard. And even though we all try our best to avoid sinking below the waters, the fact we kept looking to the waters around us instead of who was in front of us, even if the rain is coming down too hard, just makes us sink further and further, causing Him to reach even further down to prevent us from drowning. It may be hard to understand what I mean exactly by what was said above, if the reader doesn't quite know Him the way I do personally. But I think Joshua Graham felt something similar, as Edward carried him further and further along once their creations started becoming more and more real. There is not a doubt in my mind that Joshua couldn't see Christ through the storm of so much war and flame, but I believe he knew He was there. I think somewhere along the line, Graham grew frustrated with his inability to see Christ as he followed that secular man into war, causing him to sink deeper and deeper into the same waters that characterized Peter's lack of faith even as he stood upon the sea. Graham probably thought he began to see our Lord in the perceived holy work he grew to believe He was doing, as he sunk further and further beneath the waves. I have no way of knowing for certain what Joshua endured over so many years, but I believe that one day the storm finally ended in Graham's life, only to realize it was not his faith in Christ he followed, when the clouds parted and the water consumed him. I think that the clouds revealed it was the face of Caesar who came to serve as the true master he was following as he fought and fought for so long. I believe Graham's master was not the master who sacrificed everything for him despite his inevitable sin. I believe that Graham realized it was really the master of the Southwest he followed, a master who knew no mercy, a master who bestowed the price of failure onto others rather than himself. My mind was lost in thought as I remembered the face of failure from last night staring at me beside the glow of the flickering flame. My mind continued on, going this way and that, and felt what the man underwent as I robotically arrived at the last two letters.
August 4th, 2251. From Joshua Graham, Legatus Imperialis of Caesar's Legion, to the current Bishop of New Canaan and the Community of Faith. I am saddened to hear of Judah's passing. I know undoubtedly that he has kept more faith in me than you or any of the elders ever did. I will mourn his passing and pray that the community doesn't put too much pressure on his legacy because of me. I loved him greatly, and I completely understand how you will likely abandon every future attempt to contact me because of his passing and the inevitable strain his relationship with me has likely put on the rest of you. Because of your inclination towards believing the drummed-up stories you've heard about me, I do not believe I have any more ties to the rest of you. It is still unfortunate that you all fail to understand the work I do, but with Judah's passing, I see little more need to communicate with any of you or the elders. I do not intend to return anytime soon, and I will continue the work I have been trusted with till my death. But until then, I give you all my best regards and pray that you someday manage to see what I have accomplished.
Apparently, that was not the end of Graham's communications with New Canaan, despite the tone it suggested about the passing of Judah Black. However, it was clear that communications from that point forward were so strained and infrequent that any more exchanges of letters must have been hidden away in other file boxes or lost in time. Still, the last letter in that first folder told me of how infrequent communications between him and his home were, because it was the last one in the box destined for the archives of Bishop Judah Black's personal correspondence. It read like this.
July 28th, 2255. From Joshua Graham, Legatus Imperialis of Caesar's Legion, to the Community of Faith. This is my last letter to you all. I will not receive nor reply to any more attempts to contact me or my Legion. If you value the lives or freedom of your messengers from the southern tribes, you will not send them to Legion borders any longer. Flagstaff has fallen, and I write to you from a position of supreme power over northern Arizona. Accompanying this most recent triumph and the establishment of our new Rome on the campaign will certainly be more stories of my brutality. Regardless of the particulars, the result will be the same in the ears of so many innocent souls back in Ogden. I can only reiterate for the final time that my own namesake's conquest, after crossing the Jordan, was not a display of our God's mercy, but of his wrath. I am done casting my pearls before swine, so I will not attempt to justify myself anymore. You will continue to hear of me as Edward or Caesar sets his sights on New Mexico and preparations are made to march on Phoenix. And so I will leave you with one more thing. Have no fear about our march into Utah, for Edward already plans and I intend to steer him towards New Mexico and then Colorado before anything else. However, the day will undoubtedly come where the tribal plague of the Southwest is gone. And with that, we will march on Utah proper. All I ask is that you refrain from firing on Legion forces when that day comes, and I can only pray that the gates are opened for me, so that you may see the truth in what I have fought so hard to achieve.
And there I began to remember everything that happened after that letter was received. Of course, I never knew the details, but when that letter was sent, I was 16 and already preparing for missionary work when I would turn 18. The wound was still fresh, even when I finally did turn 18. I remembered the faces that looked on everyone who was about to depart for mission. I couldn't understand it at the time, but remembering those looks, I could see them say, "Don't be the next one." That may seem like a ridiculous plea to those about to depart for missionary work, even though Joshua had already been gone for so many years. However, very slowly, and over many years, the end of direct communications with the missionary translator turned right hand of a dictator morphed into the occasional story from lands beyond the wilderness in those first years after the final letter from him. When I returned from the mission at 18, my own horrendous experience was lessened by news that Sedona and Circle Junction had fallen to the Legion. I remembered Danny and I taking Michelle for her first service for baptism and hearing how the Legion was marching on Phoenix. When I had sworn into the Guard and went on my first expedition to help an ally, I heard how Phoenix had fallen. The years passed, I took part in campaigns, expeditions, and patrols. Hannah was later born. Michelle had another birthday. I lost a few men of the Guard. I was promoted to sergeant, then lieutenant. I attended so-and-so's wedding. And the stories kept coming in. The Legion conquered this place. Then they conquered that place. Arizona has fallen. Caesar's forces have routed the last tribes of New Mexico. The Legion is marching on Colorado. Denver has been encircled. Legion scouts have been sighted in eastern Utah. Our allies in the wilderness need us to take in refugees of Legion expansion, etc. As life went on, as I lived, the monstrous nation beyond the wilderness to our south and east only grew and grew. My life was punctuated by news of that nation closing in on our city inches per day, and the question remained, when the wilderness of Utah is no longer a wilderness, when all the tribes, whether hostile or allies, are all under the banner of that Roman bull, what would happen to us? I know there are many in the Guard who kept that thought in the back of their minds, wondering about the day where we would be forced to face the man who turned his back on us and what we would say when we met him at the gates. Would he spare us? Would he absorb us as well? The Legion grew and grew over the years, and we knew the man who led them in war, whether or not we were old enough to have met him personally. I thought again and again about the hypothetical day our community would have to confront him after doing our best to forget about him for almost 2 decades. What would that day look like? Then it occurred to me as I remembered all my previous recollections of what would happen that day. That day already happened. It happened just last night, and it appeared that only I had known it. The man who plagued every new Canaanite's thoughts regarding the world beyond the known wilderness, the man who could have led his armies straight up to our gates and killed or enslaved us all with minimal effort, had returned to us. The man returned to us in unbearable pain, scarred, burned, and completely broken, but only I seemed to know it. I thought of the eyes from my dream, the man walking towards me from the burning city, and there I saw the skinless body from last night, and that pleading face before it was captured by the flame of the campfire. The flame that burned him did nothing to extinguish the flame that had been hiding deep within for decades, and now I knew what I had to do. I was startled nearly half to death when my thoughts were interrupted by Duncan standing over the desk with Joseph at his side. "What are you reading?" The papers fell out of my hands, and Joseph giggled at that. Duncan stared at me expectingly as I picked up the papers off the ground in my lap. "Just old letters. The stuff Mr. Mathers was going over." I was not trying to hide the letters, but I stuffed them back into the box and closed the lid before I met Mr. Schmidt, eyes just in time to hear him say with a yawn, "Sounds exciting. Joseph and I, on the other hand, are about to die of boredom. You want to walk around with us?" Standing up, I could see Duncan looking at me strangely, but either too tired or too bored to ask about it. After shaking myself awake and the thoughts from before out of my head, I said, "Actually, let's grab lunch. We should still have time before Mr. Mathers returns." Joseph was already drooling at the idea of food, and something else occurred to me, so I asked Duncan, "How long has it been since Mr. Mathers departed?" Duncan was already walking across the room as I was hurrying to catch up with him and Joseph as the man replied, 1 hour? 6 hours? No idea. That was my guess too, so I stayed silent and walked with the two of them towards the exit. Pushing open that steel door, Joseph began running up to the top, disappearing around the corner. As soon as I reached the top, I wasn't expecting to see a crowd of people. It almost appeared as though a sermon had just ended, as over 24 deacons and at least 6 of the elders were congregating in the museum or filing down the stairs from the second floor. Puzzled at this, I instinctively scanned the temple officials for Mr. Mathers, and when I found him, my eyes immediately went to the man on his left. But more importantly, the little boy in that man's grip. Completely ignoring Mr. Mathers, he and the man in white robes holding Joseph stepped over to me. A quick glance at the red face of Joseph told me all I needed to know, and I brought my hand to my heart as I said to the man in robes, "Bishop Mordecai, I'm so sorry." The elderly leader of our community smiled at me with the softest expression I had ever seen. It wasn't often I got to be so close to Bishop Mordecai and let alone speak to him, but I only wished it had been under better circumstances as he released his grip on Joseph and smiled at him. "No need to apologize, Paul? Am I correct?" I nodded, somewhat marveling at how the bishop knew my name at sight alone. I felt Joseph cling to my legs, and the bishop addressed Joseph, "Now just be careful going up those stairs too fast, young man. Next time you'll knock me over." Haha. I'm not as spry as I used to be, and I think I have a few good years before my legs give out. I could see just in the bishop's face alone that there was no anger or any ill will in it, even after a crazy boy ran into him. I'd only met Bishop Mordecai about 2 other times, back when he was only an elder, but he even lived up to his reputation around town when it came to his legendary kindness. All the lines in his aging face were in spite of so many years being the calmest and most collected and best-intentioned leader of New Canaan during my lifetime. I struggled to break from his calm demeanor, but I felt Joseph bury his face in my leg, reminding me to say, "Joseph, did you apologize to the bishop?" Joseph muttered something into my leg and a subtle wave of the hand, and another warm smile said Joseph was completely forgiven by the bishop. Just as my eyes caught sight of the constable loudly talking to some of the elders on the other side of the room, I glanced at Mr. Mathers beside the bishop and was not expecting the bishop to address me again. The spiritual leader of our community asked me beneath the murmur of all the people in the room, "How are you, Paul? The constable, as well as Mr. Mathers here, have had nothing but great things to say about you and the situation with the guard." I began to wonder what situation in particular he was referring to when he added, "I understand you were wounded last month. Have you been healing up well?" Just like before, I hadn't really thought of my wound until it was brought up by a concerned person who was always more worried about it than I was. Seeing the calm concern in the old bishop's face, the idea of replying snarkily, like I would with a guardsman, was an alien thought, as I replied, "I'm doing just fine, sir. Thank you so much for asking, but everyone else is more concerned about it than I ever was." "I'm glad to hear that. You can never be too concerned about a bullet wound. Believe me, I think there's still a few people alive who remember when I got hit in the leg on a hunting trip with my father. That little 22 is still in my leg 40 years later. I thought it great to see the bishop had a sense of humor, and I couldn't help but smile as I saw one grow on Mr. Mather's face. Just then, the deacon hopped in. Bishop Mordecai never lets a meeting go without reminding us of that. The bishop chuckled to himself and met me again with a look of sincerity. That's no comparison to what men of the guard, men like you, go through, I know. Still, your efforts are seen and heard, and with the constable's news, I'm going to make it a point to receive more input from the guard community. In any way I'm able. I wasn't sure exactly what he was talking about, and searched my brain for what I told Mr. Mathers, the constable, or anyone. Before I could recall everything I said in recent conversations with either men, my mind hovered on the things I had seen last night. Although before I could get too lost, the bishop brought those thoughts right to the forefront. I wordlessly thanked him for the consideration, and he was about to bid me farewell and step away when he stopped himself. "Oh, and I hear you were with the guardsman who brought in an injured stranger last night?" I thought again about the calm and innocent old bishop as the memories flickered. "Yes, sir. I think he will be all right." He heard the twang of a question, but only said, "No name or anything?" Again, I knew the name of the stranger, but I couldn't confirm it since it never came from his lips. I could only shake my head as I thought of last night. The bishop lowered his head. "Well, he's not the first stranger to come to our gates. All we can do is our best for him. And from what I heard, you and the men of the Night Watch certainly did just that, so thank you for all you do, Mr. Young." I accepted the gratitude, admired his humility and understanding nature in as few words as possibly, without seeming overtly weird. Then the man stepped away, to gather with some of the other elders, as Mr. Mathers stepped up to me. "What a guy, huh?" Mr. Mathers asked, as the bishop joined a group of temple officials socializing in the museum. I continued to observe the people around us as I replied robotically, "Yeah, just like I heard he is." After briefly catching the eyes of the constable, I saw him give a subtle wave, and I nodded back before he returned to the conversation around him. The voice of Mr. Mathers entered my ears again. "Is it strange how well I know the bishop when I've only been here for 5 years and you've lived here your whole life?" I met his eyes and already replied, "Yeah, it's strange. Sorta," before I saw the grin on his face. I smiled at the joke, but it was clear to him that my mind was still elsewhere as he asked me, "Speaking of how long we have been in this town, why are you and your lackey still here? I figured you'd have gone out for lunch." Remembering what I was actually doing while he was at the meeting, I said more defensively than I probably should have, "We were just about to do that." "I thought you were heading to a meeting?" He gestured around at all the men in the room. "It's over now, pal. I didn't know it would be held upstairs, but the second floor has a conference room they just put together, and the elders decided to host the meeting here. It's a nice room upstairs. Great view of the town square from up there, plenty of room, and I can show you upstairs if you like." I watched the room begin to clear as the religious leaders slowly began to end their prospective conversations and depart out the front door. More and more people left, and I found myself once more lost in thought about everything I had read, about the brief conversation with Mordecai, and the few short words with Mr. Mathers. All seemed to be business as usual across all of New Canaan, and here Mr. Mathers was asking me if I would like to see the nice little conference room on the second floor of the museum building. I finally turned to face him, and when I did, I could see him still waiting for an answer to the question he asked with the usual innocence on his face. But I couldn't stop myself from giving him a near plea for answers about what he knew. The question rang in my mind again. "While I'm away, could you find the file box marked BR-346-22-BBPC? Mr. Mathers knew what was in that box. Whether or not he knew the specific contents or not was irrelevant. He knew what had happened last night and who the stranger was. But why was he acting like it was nothing? His face morphed into a concern once more the longer I stared at him until finally I croaked out, "Look, I think I need to talk to you about something. Some of that stuff down there in the archive." At that, his face hadn't changed. All he did was lean to the right and give nods at the people behind me. It was a nod of sympathy, a nod that told me it was only Duncan and Joseph leaning against the wall, not understanding anything other than how miserably bored they were. The deacon looked back at me and said only, "We'll talk later. For now, go get some food and spend the rest of the day at home. It can't do you any good to be stuck in that basement all day. I'll come to your home later and we can talk about whatever you need. Just get some food first. Remember the angel that came to Elijah, and don't stress yourself about anything." Take care of yourself, and we'll talk soon. I promise." I glanced back, saw my son and the young guardsman leaning against the wall as if to say they were waiting on me, and all my curiosities left for the moment as I was reminded of my responsibilities to take care of myself and others. Without anything more than a nod back at Mr. Mathers, the agreement was made, and I took my son and Mr. Schmidt out of the museum into the new Canaan town square at a little past midday. 1 hour later. It really is surprising how a little bit of food and a change of scenery can do wonders for your mental state. Problems before eating aren't that big a deal once some food is in the stomach, and you can approach the rest of your worries with a clear and focused mind. I had a great lunch with my boy and the young guardsman, but in the end, the sun was a little lower in the west, and Joseph was excited to go home and play, while Duncan was excited to do literally anything other than return to that basement. Joseph's friends were still in school by the time we began the walk home, and he was looking forward to ruling the whole block until school let out. But along the way home from Leslie's little bakery, I remembered that I still had one last thing to do before returning home. It was what I promised the constable I would do last night. I had to pick up some medications to aid in my healing from Dr. Franklin, and it was remembering this that made my heart nearly stop once more. I froze in place on the street back home, and when I was asked by Duncan what the issue was, I briefly considered having them come with me because the idea of being so close to the burned man frightened me for some unexplainable reason. Then I thought about just having Duncan go fetch the meds for me, and as good an idea as that was, I, for some reason, couldn't utter it. My mouth and mind were on different trains of thought because despite everything I was thinking, I told Duncan, "Can you take Joseph the rest of the way home? I need to visit Dr. Franklin outside the gate. The constable said she would have some medications for me to pick up after I was done with Mr. Mathers." I was mortified when Duncan replied, "I know. I'm pretty sure I was the one who told you that, but whatever, you got it, Chief," and immediately began to depart with Joseph at his side. I stood there in the middle of the street for several seconds after they left, not even hearing it when Duncan said he was going to go straight to something after dropping off Joseph. It was probably just to check in with Doyle, but I didn't hear anything else until he said sarcastically, "Tell the burned man I said, 'What up?'" By the time those words entered my ears, I was watching him start to race Joseph down the street, and there I stood until I was brought back to the present by the sound of the gates lowering down the south road. Once more my mind was entirely elsewhere, as I made my way down the south street from the town square straight toward the gate to the market. I tried with all my might to focus on what I needed to do without anything else. Running on autopilot, my body and mouth greeted the passers-by warmly. I said hello to the guard patrols and gate crews. I even walked with Richard Stanley and his guardsmen for several minutes, catching up with him about something. I again couldn't tell you. I was only thinking. Get to Dr. Franklin. Get my meds. Tell Joshua Graham that Mr. Schmidt says what up. Ask him about why he thought he could return to New Canaan after all the atrocities he's committed. No. Get to Dr. Graham, Franklin. Ask her for burn cream. No. Get to Dr. Franklin. Tell Joshua that we forgive him. No. Such a simple thing I had to do. I neglected to even consider whether or not the man was awake. Or if the skinless stranger was even Joshua Graham, for that matter. Yesterday was just a coincidence, right? God choosing to remain anonymous in my life. The man I helped bring in last night was probably just a survivor from a raided caravan. Some tribal raiders down south are known to use the occasional flamethrower. The story I heard about Graham's end was just a story. I read the letters. Joshua and Edward were best friends. They conquered the whole Southwest for decades. They were best buds. I'm sure Edward was a bit miffed by Joshua losing that battle at the dam down south, but I'm sure they worked it out like best pals do. Plus, even if the stories about his fiery execution were true, there's no way a man could survive getting set on fire and tossed into the Grand Canyon. There's no way the Lord would spare a man who defied him the way Joshua Graham did, especially in such a fashion. Unless, of course, God was not through with his plans for such a man of such great sin. These were my last thoughts before I felt my hand on the doorknob to Dr. Franklin's little clinic outside the walls. My heart skipped a beat when I heard John Langdon say from behind, "Anyway, Nate and I will leave you be. You get well, Lieutenant Young, and make sure that stranger is all right." A brief glance behind showed Nate and John turn to resume their patrol of the busy market grounds. and I was going to ask how long I'd been talking to them when I decided not to. I did watch them continue along, Nate talking loudly about his suggestions for a gift basket of some sort before they disappeared into the crowd, and then I turned the doorknob to Dr. Franklin's clinic. Stepping inside, I was immediately greeted by Dr. Franklin wiping her hands on the apron around her dress as she stepped behind the wooden counter. "Good to see you, Mr. Young. I take it you've been having a calm day? No more spontaneous bleeding, I presume?" My eyes took in the dim shack clinic, all the healing instruments and tools on shelves behind the counter, and daylight from outside pouring in through the foggy windows. It had been a while since I was here, ever since the White Leg ambush a month ago, but I remembered the place being more welcoming. My eyes lingered on the open doorway to the patient area that seemed almost pitch black from where I was standing in the day-lightened, musty little lobby. I met her eyes, saw the flakes of blood on her apron, and said, "I'm doing just fine now. I was even just fine last night, but I suppose the wound opened and it freaked out the constable." "That'll happen," said Dr. Franklin as she seemed more focused on the patient charts atop the counter. "It was probably just reopened from chaffing against your vest all day. I see that doesn't sway you, though." I felt the heavy black tactical vest on my person full of equipment I rarely used even on patrol days. I probably should have gone without it today, especially since I was on my behind there in the archives for what felt like the whole day. I shrugged the thoughts out of my mind and said to the doctor, "Force of habit. You can still vouch for me to the constable. I can't stand light duty. Idle hands do the enemy's work and all that." "I hear you," said the doctor, still more focused on the patient charts. A silence lingered before she glanced up and said, "Speaking of the constable, I got something I'm supposed to give you." At that, she pulled something up from below the cabinet and placed it on the countertop. It was a syringe bearing the gauge and familiar look of a typical stimpack. Another moment passed before she looked up at me and asked, "Can you do it yourself or you want me?" I rolled my sleeve up and took a seat on the little fold-out waiting chair next to me, and she was already maneuvering around the counter. "Not much experience," said I as she stepped up and uncapped the syringe. She flicked the needle's end and said as she tied a band around my arm, "I've met mercs who refuse stims trying to be tough, but y'all guardsmen's aversion to them is still somewhat strange if you ask me." The doctor held up my arm. "We try not to rely on them. Plus, some in the community of faith don't believe in such medicines. I don't personally have an issue with them unless it's an emergency. Which this isn't, but constable's orders." She gripped the end of the band in her teeth as she sank the needle into my arm, replying, "Yeah, this ain't no emergency now, but if anything, this'll help finish what the first one started a month ago." The plunger was pressed all the way down. She removed the needle, released the band with a snap, and I immediately felt the strange sensation that came with a Stimpack serum's miraculous repair work all over my body. As I asked, "Is it usual for Stimpack-healed wounds to reopen so easily after so long? I've been fine for the most part since I left your clinic a month ago, and I'm not sure why the wound reopened last night, especially since I wasn't breaking boulders." She stood over me and wiped the end of the needle before opening up one of her childish sticky bandages with the Vault Boy on it. She pressed it to my arm, grinned at the silly bandage on a lieutenant of the guard, and said in thought, "Not unusual, I guess. Just not often. Some folks get so badly beat up that they need a couple stims just to get through the same firefight." She paused, and I think we were both wondering if it was possible for someone to overdose on Stimpaks, since I heard of similar situations out there. After a moment, she added, "Kinda like your friend you brought in last night. My boys and I doped him up real good and gave him another stim after he got here and nothing. I can't say I'd ever even heard of someone immune to the effects of meds and chems like the ones we gave him." After a short respite, I'd all but forgotten about the man I recovered, the man I researched, and the man whose identity I refused to admit I knew. But the doctor's words reminded me of the same thing I saw last night, the effects of a healing drug, and how it didn't have the ability to heal such a man. I looked up to the doctor and asked, "How is he? Do you know his name? How did he ended up like that?" She looked a bit puzzled at the way I asked that, but looked at the ceiling in thought for a moment before saying, "The boys said they got some food in him, and he was able to sit up after we got the bandages on him, but no chit-chat. He doesn't seem in a talking mood, so we hadn't tried, honestly." Dr. Franklin was already moving back to her spot behind the counter, but passing the entryway to the patient room. She took a long look in there before continuing on. Noticing this made me look once more towards that dark entryway, but even in the short time I spent looking, I felt a rush of cold wash over me before I looked back at the doctor. Standing over the papers on her counter, she was staring at me as if to ask if I needed anything else. I couldn't speak. I couldn't even stand to depart like I wanted to, and just before I could ask the doctor for help since something seemed so wrong with me, she asked what I was least expecting. "Want to go meet the stranger?" My blood froze, and I couldn't discern where all this fear in me was coming from, even if I was the only one in New Canaan who knew the significance of this man's identity. I wanted to reply but couldn't. I only met the eyes of the doctor and watched her raise a hand pointing toward the entryway as she added, "Go pop in and say hello if you want. I think he's still out, but he's been getting visitors all day." I wanted to ask who he's been meeting with, but I still couldn't speak at the idea of going in there to see the burned and broken body of the biggest stain on our community's history. My curiosity was answered when she said what an unclouded mind would have already known. Why so many of the townies have been leaving gifts for the stranger is still a custom of you people I fail to understand, Burns or no. At last she was done speaking, and still the question remained, do I go in or not? I sat there thinking about my son at home with my wife and the young guardsman, likely now going about some other task for Doyle or the constable. I thought of what I had told my wife earlier this morning, and how I promised I would talk with her about what I said last night. I knew that I had mentioned the stranger's true name, but whether or not she believed my words were a product of delirium or not, I couldn't have that talk with her. I couldn't have it until I knew for sure. Despite everything running through my mind, and despite everything I knew inside, I had to hear it. So, I finally looked up to the doctor and said, "Sure, I'll say hello." I asked myself again and again why I said that, and wondered why I was standing myself up. The doctor got back to work at the counter, and I approached the dark entryway to the patient section of the clinic shack only to watch the darkness miraculously vanish as soon as I stepped foot on the other side. I entered the room, seeing the whole room lit up by lanterns and daylight from the small windows, and began forward. Stepping past 3 rows of beds and the slim little dividers, I saw 2 of the beds occupied by what looked like tribesmen lying in deep sleep, and passing the next one, I saw one of the doctor's assistants from last night talking in hushed tone to a traitor-looking man in a wide hat. Just as I passed the 4th row, I nearly collided with the other assistant who apologized and greeted me by name in whispers, before saying with a smile, "If you're looking for the stranger you brought in, he's 2 more down, corner bed." My mind was a swarm, and I didn't know what else was happening before I found myself standing in the opening to the final patient bed, and staring at the man from last night, lying completely on his back, and covered in bandages just like Mr. Schmidt said earlier that morning. My heart nearly skipped a beat once more when I thought he was awake, but a closer look showed me his eyes were closed, and there my eyes went to the little cubicle he occupied. There were at least 7 tattered old baskets, each full of a random assortment of foods and bottled drinks, each one dotted with some kind of 200-year-old ointments or burn lotions. I stepped further into the room, reading and recognizing the names on the baskets. This one is from the Upson family. This one is from the Morales family. I read the names, thinking of the families and how these gestures were so like them before I could wonder how so many had heard about the stranger. Me and the night guardsmen brought in only last night. There would likely be more to come, but when I was done, I found myself sitting on the open chair next to the bedside operating cabinet and staring at the dim lantern burning on the wall above. I stared at that light for a long time, seeing the burned and bandaged man's chest rising slowly up and down in my peripherals again and again and again and again. Chapter 6. The Prodigal Son, Part 3. Hours later. I don't know how long exactly I sat there in that room, but I could tell that Dr. Franklin's orderlies began to wonder that themselves right alongside me. I knew it was a long time only by the light coming in from the windows becoming less and less bright. All I was thinking about the whole time was how I was still most likely the only one in New Canaan who pieced together the burned stranger's identity. As much as I thought about that, and as long as I thought about it, no amount of thoughts could lead me to any conclusion about what to do with that information, if it was a returned stray, as I saw his chest rise and fall in my peripherals over and over and over again. I was right in my earlier assessment. I was by no means the last visitor of the day for the mysterious burned man. and my body said hello to everyone who stumbled into the patient cubicle that afternoon to leave a gift for the unfortunate soul. There must have been about 4 or 5 new people from the town who did so after my arrival, each one asking me how I was doing, why I was here, how the man was holding up, and how I was holding up. A couple of them asked what I knew about the stranger, and I don't remember what I would say exactly, but I know I didn't reveal that truth I knew inside. Most, however, just left their gifts in one of the few unoccupied spaces around the patient bed and went about their way. All the while, and when I wasn't replying robotically to the new arrivals, I continued to stare at that light, watch the bandaged chest rise and fall, and think. Why I was waiting for so long, I did not know exactly. Part of me believed I could have gone home, enjoyed my light duty, and done some things around the house, but still, I sat. The minutes and eventual hours would continue to pass, and there wasn't anything I could do about it other than await the answer that part of me that controlled my actions needed to hear. Await the moment I could hear that confession about the man's true identity. Would he deny it? Would he play ignorant? Would he become angry, remorseful? Who knew? Finally, the end of the day was drawing near. What my wife and children were thinking, wondering where I was, or why, I could not even contemplate. I watched the light turn red in the setting sun as the beams from outside faded further away, only to be replaced evermore by the glow of the amber lanterns. It was around this time where the trance that held me captive for so long finally released its grip on me for a moment. The man gave a cough to clear his throat, signifying the only unique sound within the cubicle in what I imagined was several hours. My eyes turned from the light of the lantern to the man slowly and ever so painfully sitting his bandaged body up, forcing more of that cough in an apparent effort to clear his throat. He sat himself up further, scanning the length of his body exposed by the cloth blanket, and then he turned his head straight at me, his eyes meeting mine and shining at me like I wouldn't have believed. The memory of my dream flashed before me again. This time it was the dream made reality, a face wrapped in tattered white cloth, the burns still visible through the wide eye slit, and those eyes stared into me as blue as the dream. I must have kept my composure, but still felt my heart beating faster than it should have, and there I felt a wave of fear wash over me that I couldn't explain. The world slowed in the short moment, until the man winced at the adjustment he made to his arm. Then he spoke to me, as if he hadn't spoken or used his voice for anything other than screams in agony for months. Deep, soft, and gritty like audible gravel, the burned man said straight to me.
You're the man who helped me.
He swallowed painfully before adding,
Last night, correct?
I saw his eyes turn to the water bottle on the bedside table and reflexively handed it to him, staying silent and nodding as I watched the man look over the various gift baskets and buckets around his bed. He continued to scan the room as he opened the bottle. With his free hand, I watched him hesitate before doing what he knew he needed to do. He lowered the bandage from over his mouth and forced the bottle down his throat. I watched the tears arise and choke him as he tilted the bottle. The tears poured from his eyes just as fast as the liquid went down his throat, and the silent struggle told me that every part of that simple act was pure misery. Finally, he squeezed the bottle when it was completely empty and threw it across the room as though he couldn't get rid of it fast enough, or as if it had intentionally caused him great pain. The act of drinking that water was so painful that he immediately fell back onto the pillow and breathed heavily as can be for several long moments, collecting himself and suppressing every desire to scream in pain. He lay there breathing heavily, and I continued to watch him in silence before I felt the words leave my lips. It's that painful for you, is it? His chest rose up and down as he stared at the ceiling for a full minute after I spoke. Then his eyes glanced back down towards me before returning to that spot on the ceiling as he replied softly between the heavy breaths.
Every minute, every action. It is all far too much.
Another long silence ensued, and the air between us became still as can be. Just as I remembered from the previous night, everything I saw told me the exact same thing his words just said. I could only just watch as the breaths became less and less heavy. The collection of himself was a slow but steady process, and still, the light from outside got dimmer and dimmer with the setting sun until he finally managed to sit himself up on the bed again, only wincing slightly at the continued pain of his existence. When he was sitting upright, he looked to the ceiling and muttered something I couldn't discern if I were 3 feet closer, and his mouth wasn't wrapped. It wasn't long before his eyes returned to my own, and without any thought, I involuntarily sought another confession about the truth of his experience. "How did you end up like this? What happened to you?" His eyes broke from mine, and he looked to the stool across the room beside the entryway. He gulped as if preparing for another painful vocal response, and all he said was,
"I got what I deserved."
Then his chest began to rise and fall heavily once again. My mind was a completely blank slate at this moment. I wasn't able to consider anything, or tell you what I was thinking for the life of me. Like I had been the whole afternoon, my body was acting, and my mind was gone. I simply had no idea that I would be talking to this man when I woke up this morning, or what I would say. The more I tried to think about what I would say, the more my mind wouldn't let me. Every part of me wanted to just go home and lay with my wife at my side, go to bed and wake up tomorrow morning like this whole day was a dream. But it wasn't. This was the waking world. This was an encounter I wanted no part in, but didn't have the ability to refuse when the spirit took control. I only shocked myself when I said to the man, "That answer isn't good enough. What happened to you?" His eyes met mine, and his eyes between the bandages pleaded with me to stop even though he couldn't say so. The words I spoke above echoed in my mind, and realizing what they were, I literally felt my face. I was expecting to feel a face creased with lines of seriousness. Instead, my face was completely and unmistakably calm, friendly, concerned, not demanding of anything despite the harshness of the words I spoke. All the while, the man's eyes pleaded with me to put an end to these simple but horrendously painful questions. Despite the bandage-wrapped face staring back at me, I could picture the face beneath, as if the wrapping wasn't there. The man staring and pleading with me was not the legate of Caesar's legion. He was not the general and conqueror of the Southwest, the black stain on the community of faith, the subject of tribal stories too brutal and vulgar to even describe, or anything. The man staring at me was a mortal man, a man who failed his true Lord just like I myself. And every person who knew the Lord does every day. His sin, despite the number, despite the scale, was no different than mine or anyone's regardless of what the world may say. But here I was, sitting in the seat I was not worthy of sitting upon and demanding his confession on behalf of the Lord. I tried my best, yet still always failed to serve. Yet my mind, my true mortal mind, remained elsewhere in this moment. My body, was not my own. It was merely being used like the vessel it was for the purposes of something larger than I could handle. My mind took off for home, running out of the clinic and through the gates of New Canaan as my mouth demanded again like the tool it was. "What happened to you?" The burned and bandaged man clenched his fists in the blanket but didn't dare look away from me. I saw this, and again mentally bolted for the exit as he sneered in unbearable pain.
"Why are you so understanding?"
He swallowed, feeling the inferno engulf his body again.
"Why do you ask these things with care on your face?"
"There's care on my face?" I thought to myself. Again, hearing the echoing words like the stern demand they were, I felt my face once more only to feel the muscles completely relaxed. Then I said to him what my mind had been keeping in the background all day, before considering the possibility of this, and if it could even happen in my normal life. I demanded from the fire-wrapped man on the hospital bed the reason I had not gone home this day, why I sat with him the whole afternoon, and why everything I did and experienced this day happened in order for me to sit here. I told the man, "I need to hear you say it." At that, he broke from me and fell back onto the pillow. His arms moved like he wanted to cover his face, but perhaps it was the pain that prevented him from doing so. His chest began to rise and fall heavily again, and his eyes remained locked on the ceiling above. More silence passed. I had already mentally returned home for the 70th time, but I could not move, and the broken man was all I could see in the glow of the lantern and darkness outside. I don't know how long the moment was, but the light from outside was almost gone, and the amber of the lanterns around us was all there was to illuminate this moment, seemingly surrounded by a world so dark. I couldn't tell you how long this short exchange of words was, or how long the silence lasted after my previous words. All I knew was that I was still very distant from this man and everything I found myself saying when he said to that ceiling,
"So you know who I am? You know what happened to me?"
All I could say was again, "I need to hear you say it." He looked down from the ceiling, seeing my face had not changed. A part of me knew that the man watching him was not necessarily the same guy who entered the clinic. I believe he knew that it wasn't necessarily me who required these answers. He knew that the one inhabiting my body at this moment was the one who inhabits everyone who knows him, the one who will take control when we are not needed in particular moments. It's sometimes hard to feel it, but sometimes it is possible to know that certain moments in your life are not being lived by you, and the words of Galatians 2:20 begin to make sense. It was not I who sat before the prodigal needing him to confess himself before a brother. It was Christ who lives in me, and he demanded the confession before Joshua Graham could even begin to repent in the company of his true family. Staring into my eyes, the burned man said in painful resignation,
"I will. All I ask is that you bring me to the heart before I do."
I nodded in agreement, even though I had no idea what I was agreeing to, and the burned man broke from his gaze to look back at the ceiling. All at once, I felt completely present, and I looked around the room and back at the burned man, about to ask, "Wait, what is it I was going to do for you?" Just as the first syllable left my lips, a shout from behind said, "Hi, Dad!" Before I could turn around, I felt the arms of Joseph wrap around my neck, and the unexpected voice brought me even more to the present. Just as I stood and turned around, I saw my wife and Michelle stepping through the opening to the burned man's little room. I saw the metal pail full of food items and trinkets similar to the other gifts around the room in Michelle's hands, and Joseph clung to my neck as my wife said softly, "Shh, Joseph. Keep it down, there are other patients resting here." Joseph immediately began yelling about all the trouble he got himself in before school for the other kids got out, and Danny apologized to the burned man as I stood there in slight bewilderment. Danny said, "I'm so sorry for the disturbance, sir. I'm sure you know how little boys can be." Danny looked at me and ushered Michelle into the room.
"It's all right, ma'am,"
said the burned man. Michelle's eyes lingered on me for a moment as she placed the pail next to the foot of the bed and returned to her mother's side by the entrance. Joseph broke his grip on me and began whispering at the stranger about how he looked like a mummy. Before I could shoo Joseph away from the burned legate, prodigal, missionary translator, I was already being pulled towards my wife by her calm demeanor and questioning eyes. She motioned for Michelle to take care of Joseph and offer the stranger anything, while she wordlessly pulled me past the divider to the walkway. I glanced towards the lobby entryway, still seeing Dr. Franklin mulling over papers on the counter, and placed myself against the wall, distant from the burned man's patient bay. A brief glance out the foggy windows showed it was dark out and the street lanterns around the market were burning. I could hear whispers going on around the burned man's bed, but I couldn't think about that for long as I felt the eyes on the side of my head. I looked at my wife, seeing her beautiful green eyes and freckles illuminated in the lantern light, and saw the same face as the one I saw last night as I returned home with my torso wrapped in bloody bandages. Meeting her eyes, she asked me softly and full of worry, "Are you okay, Paul? Joseph said you were just going to pick up some medications, but you've been gone for hours. Have you been here the whole time?" I couldn't look away when I saw my wife's pretty face twisted with worry, and grappled to keep my thoughts on focus for a moment before saying to her calmly, "Yes, I've been here all day. I'm sorry for being so late. I just lost track of time and felt responsible for checking up on the man I helped bring in last night. He seems to be doing all right." Her face fell and she nodded understandingly as I felt her arm wrap gently around my torso. She held me tight and looked towards the entryway, hearing the whispers. From where we were standing, she and I could only see the legs of both Michelle and Joseph, apparently kneeling before the stranger's bed, and the whispers began to make sense as the faint words of prayer were heard in the whispers. I continued to embrace my wife in the silent moment, not sure what she was thinking as my thoughts were split between her arrival and what I promised the burned man. At last, I felt Danny's head move from its spot on my breast, and there she asked in a soft voice, "I'm so proud of you, Paul." I went to kiss her head as we kept our eyes on the feet of our children, but I knew there was more. As soon as my lips left her head, she said to me, "I didn't want to do this here, but I've been worried about you all day, and what you said last night." She lifted her head off of me and faced me with that same look of concern on her face. Trying to remember what I said and how I should reply, she asked, "What did you mean when you said that?" She glanced not towards the entryway to the man's patient bay, but towards the lobby entryway before finishing. That man in there, was he harmed by the Legion? I felt my eyebrow raise, asking, "What do you mean?" She continued to look at me in an almost terrified state and appeared to be slightly trembling, unable to understand my confusion as she explained, "Yesterday evening, Doyle came to our house waiting for you to return, saying something about a scouting report he was to go over with you. Then Mr. Schmidt barges in to haul him away, saying they were getting the constable and that the night guard needed them. Next thing I know, you're coming home long after your shift, and you end the night saying that Joshua Graham's returned or something." I couldn't say anything. She knew this, and when her words didn't garner a single sound, she grabbed me with both arms and said, "Paul, I know you have your duties for the guard, but if the Legion is marching this way, you need to tell me. We have a family to think about. You need to tell the others. We need to reach out to our allies and... Oh God." She bit her hand, unable to go on out of sheer panic about such an idea. Once all her words had registered in my brain, I replied. I really didn't want to, but my first response to her concerns was to snort in laughter. Thankfully, I was able to catch it, but not before the amusement on my face made hers twist into a look of anger I'd only seen 2 or 3 times since marrying her. She was about to demand what was so funny when I had collected myself and asked her with a straight face, "Who's that man in there?" She threw her hands up, still recovering from the short burst of anger. I could see her mind was still swarming with all kinds of thoughts, none making any less sense than the thoughts I'd been considering all day. She answered with a puff, "I don't know." "Someone the Legion maimed on the march?" I snorted again and swatted myself because I again didn't want to do that. She glared at me and I remembered exactly what I said last night. I was still trying to figure out how she could take those words, "Joshua Graham's returned as Graham's, leading forces here." I could not imagine. I again was still trying to figure out this connection she made, and didn't even consider the repercussions when my mouth said to her a reminder of what I really said. I said, "Joshua Graham's returned last night, not his Legion is coming." I would have slapped my hand over my mouth if the instant effect of my words on her face didn't leave me in paralysis. I watched that beautiful, slightly frustrated and unnerved face twist into the coldest and most terrified expression I'd ever seen inhabit her countenance. Her trembling from earlier had ceased, and she was too petrified in fright as my words hit her. I watched her slowly turn towards the patient bay, where our children were still kneeling before the legate in prayer. I felt her grip on my abdomen tighten like a death grip without any regard for my wound, and knew she was too stunned to run in there and rush her babies out of that room or ask me to say it wasn't so. As ridiculous as it may sound, I still had that faint doubt inside that the burned stranger in there really was Joshua Graham, even though every fiber of my being and the Spirit of the Lord that inhabited me earlier said it was so. You can call it denial. Still, it was at this moment that I checked myself out mentally and walked home with my wife saying, "You got it from here, Lord. I can't handle this," when I actually said to my wife, "Keep calm. I'm going to help him tonight." She turned to me whiter than a sheet, stammering, "But what should I? What are you? How can he?" I embraced her tighter and said with her head pressed to my chest, "Don't worry about it, just take Michelle home. I'll be home later tonight and have no fear. Everything will make sense soon, I promise." I again had no idea what I was going to do, why I promised that or anything, but I felt her release her grip, look at me, and wipe something from her eye before asking, "You're taking Joseph with you?" "Yes. We'll be home together once I've finished with Joshua," I immediately asked myself internally. Why was I keeping Joseph around? And what am I going to do with Joshua? Before my internal bewilderment could show on my face, my wife nodded at me and said, "Okay, honey, I trust you." Still not knowing exactly what I promised my wife, I could only watch from the sidelines as my wife entered the patient bay of the burned man, and I maneuvered over to the entryway, just in time to see my eldest daughter and my youngest child laughing and giggling beside the burned man's bed. I had no idea what they were laughing or talking about, but even seeing the burned body of Joshua Graham sitting up as if the pain were nothing, and joining them in the amusement, almost gave me the urge to vomit for some inexplicable reason. I was too astonished to say or even hear anything, but I could watch as my wife broke up the little gathering around the bedside by taking Michelle by the shoulder and walking her out of the room. Joseph got up to run out the door with his mom and sister, but Danny told him to stay put and come home with his father. I took another step into the cubicle, and just before Danny gave me a peck on the cheek with the words, "See you tonight," I saw the face of my beautiful daughter apparently blushing and leaving the wrapped man with the sweet words, "We hope to see you again soon, sir." Every fiber of my being wanted to ask what on earth my daughter and son were talking about with the Legion's former legate, but I couldn't as my wife and daughter disappeared out of the room, leaving me with Joseph and the burned man. My eyes returned to the young boy hopping up and down in the middle of the room beside the bed, and even though Joshua remained motionless, I could see underneath the bandages and the smile on his face. As soon as we met eyes again, the weight of the air in the room was enough to crush someone, and it apparently did so as evidenced by Joseph, who cut what he was saying to the man short by turning to me, making that smile on his face instantly disappear. I stepped closer. Joseph became less hyper, and I took my place on the chair I occupied the whole afternoon. Joseph hovered by my side as the silence lingered between the man and I. After a long moment, Joseph took a seat on the floor beside my feet and began playing with that string from earlier when the burned man said to me calmly, with that pain still a whisper behind the words,
"You have a lovely family, Paul."
He paused, apparently seeing something on my face as he added,
"Don't look too surprised. Your children told me your name."
I couldn't think of what to say, still wondering what my children were talking and laughing about with him, and trying to remember what I was apparently supposed to do for him or with him. Something involving Joseph for some reason, I thought, as I still tried to figure out why I told my wife I wanted my young son with me for it. As I was trying to figure out what that was exactly, Joseph said from the floor, "What's your name, mister?" "I think Michelle has a crush on you." Wherever my mind was, it returned in a flash at that, and the words made the man actually chuckle as thoughts of my blushing daughter made me sick, puzzled, horrified, and amused at the same time. The sound of this man laughing at Joseph's suggestion would have been funny if I didn't know internally who he was, what happened to him, and see the pain rushing from his eyes at the laugh. Joseph's eyes went to me, mentally asking if he should apologize after seeing how much pain his boyish words put his new friend in. Joshua collected himself as the momentary silence lingered, and the boy expectedly never apologized. Once Joshua was collected, I'd all but forgotten Michelle's seeming infatuation with the scorched man and added on to Joseph's question. "I too am curious about your name. I don't believe we'd gotten that far in our introductions." I remained waiting for an answer, but part of me knew it wouldn't come as Joseph asked the man a different question. "Do you have kids, mister?" I would have reprimanded the boy since I still required an answer to the question I asked, but the burned man's eyes focused on me even more as he decided he would answer the new one. With his gaze on me, he said to the boy,
"No, son. I don't have any children."
He paused, clearly pained by the words. Then he said,
"But there were many who relied on me in the past. Many with childlike minds. Many who could hardly be blamed for what they do."
Joseph went on saying how he was blamed for many things he does and doesn't do all the time, but his words seemed to vanish in the background as the burned man and I locked eyes. As Joseph went on more to himself than anything, I found myself saying to the man, "I still need to hear you say your name." The boy went on, and the man cringed in pain. He knew what he had to do, and so did I, even when he answered.
"You already know my name, Paul."
The boy continued talking, more to himself now that he realized there was something happening between his father and this stranger. The man said after a short silence,
"Forgive me, but—"
He paused again, and Joseph went completely quiet as the silence consumed the world around us three. Then the burned stranger reminded me of what I promised earlier.
"Take me inside, and I promise I will tell you what you need to know."
Just then, out of the corner of my eyes, I could see Joseph's eyes going to me, then to the burned man, back and forth wondering what was happening. Without any more words, Joshua held out his arms, and I still didn't know what I was promising to do as I stood myself up, grabbed his arms, and hoisted him up off the bed till he was on his feet. The burned man let out another cry in pain. Joseph shook in fear. asking what was happening, where we were going, and why. I wanted to explain to the boy, but I didn't have the words or the idea of what I was doing myself. As I had done the whole day, I was acting autonomously, even as Dr. Franklin and her helpers came into the room asking what we were doing. The orderlies tried to tell him and I that he wasn't in a condition to move around. That was evident by the amount of pain I could feel emanating from his body as I propped him out of the room, down the hall, and towards the door. Dr. Franklin and her assistants tried to get him and I to stop as Joseph followed along, and I don't know what I told them to make them back off, but I did hear it when the burned man said through the screaming sobs,
"Don't you dare put me back."
I remember the doctor retreating behind the counter, telling her assistants to let me go. Then I pushed open the door to the clinic, and with the burned, wrapped, and broken body of Joshua Graham propped up by me and me alone, we entered the streets outside the wall, as that little boy followed us, unsure what else to do. I don't remember much more. We passed so many people, all of them likely asking me what I was doing, or saying that the clinic was in the opposite direction. I don't know what I said to the gate crews or night guard, but the gates into town were open before us, and down the dusty streets we went. The man continued to scream in pain, muffling his cries into my arm when he could, and even though his pain seemed loud enough to wake the whole town, the streets remained vacant this time of night. I remember seeing the occasional lights turn on in some of the buildings we passed, but could not hear anything other than the muffled shouts and deep, heavy breathing of the suffering man I carried along. Inching further and further down the main street, straight towards the town square we went, and the strain of carrying him with his arm around my neck sent my mind again elsewhere, until it at last returned, just as I pushed open the heavy doors to the temple. We entered the place I unknowingly promised to take him, and the doors shut behind us with a crash. The man fell from my grip onto the large rug in the center of the reception area, and Joseph stood by the door still confused, worried, and wondering what was happening as I took the moment to catch my breath and collect myself. I would have immediately helped the man up, but the view around me had taken me off guard and captured my attention, as my breathing slowed from having carried him for so far. I had never seen the inside of the temple after nighttime, or at least when all the lights were off. The rows and rows of pews sat vacant beyond the archway into the congregation, and I nearly jumped when I thought I heard someone else inside. But I realized the noise was only the echoing sound of the doors shutting, the sound traveling through the tall halls and disappearing into the black ceiling. I followed the sound up and up above the great open room, but stopped upon seeing the stained glass on the far end high above the organ pipes. I looked beyond the dark church halls and straight into that mass of blue, yellow, red, and green glass, the only thing that made the inside of this place illuminated. Staring up at the glass on the far wall, the light came in as one singular color despite the variation, and there I could see the vaguest outline of the moon beyond the glass, shining into this place and emphasizing the black cross in the center of those glass colors that surrounded it. My attention fell from the moonlit stained glass when the man huffed and puffed there on the floor beside me and said painfully,
"Thank you so much, Paul."
I felt the emptiness of the room, glanced at my son still standing by the door, and then at the burned and wrapped man on his hands and knees atop a woven rug. I don't know where the words came from, but my only response to the burned man was, "Don't thank me, thank Christ." I stopped, hearing the distant noise outside. I couldn't discern what it was exactly, but my eyes went to the group of communion stands on the left-hand side of the entryway. Despite the occasion, I inexplicably thought, so that's where they keep them before service. An idle thought that didn't mean anything other than the fact that mentally I was still somewhere else. But my view of the familiar objects ended when the man rose to his feet, giving a pained groan, and my eyes followed him as he stumbled further into the building, under the large archway, and straight down the central rug between the long rows of so many pews. I found myself placed right under the archway, standing motionless as I watched him stumble even further towards the pulpit and stained glass on the far wall, bearing the moonlit cross staring down at us. Watching Joshua proceed further and further, I saw the white cross emblazoned on the podium, reflecting what little light there was in this grand hall. Watching him pass more and more rows of pews, limping, groaning, and stumbling, as if each step were beyond agonizing. Halfway there, I felt Joseph beside me, and then felt it as he wrapped his arms around my leg, silently taking in the same view as me. There was nothing either of us could say as Joshua limped his way closer and closer toward that cross, but just before he reached the short steps up to the podium, my senses returned for a single second, just to realize the sound from earlier was the sound of a crowd outside the heavy doors behind us. I took several steps further into the building, past a few rows with my boy beside me, and just when we stopped, Joshua collapsed onto the steps before the podium. I don't know if it was the silence of the dark temple at night, the acoustics of the room, or if I was simply just meant to hear it, but even the distant noise from outside vanished when I heard the burned man begin to sob in the most painful-sounding way I had ever heard. The sounds of pain I heard today and the night before were nothing when he was kneeling before the cross of the podium and illuminated by the cross in the stained glass high above. The piercing wail echoed through the halls. I felt Joseph cling to me tighter, and on the other end of the room, I heard almost like a pleading and desperate whisper.
I am so sorry, Lord. I never should have left you. Please forgive me.
Almost every word was punctuated by a burst of such painful sobs, and I had no idea what to think or do. Hearing those wails and seeing the man collapsed on the stairs beneath the crosses, my mind did not know what to say or do, even if I didn't feel that strange paralysis come over me again at the sight. My mind ran through every word of those letters I read, and images of what I imagined Legion conquests to be like flashed before my mind. I saw the fires, the blood, the vicious battles, slaughters, the horrors of occupation and enslavement. I could only imagine when I met refugees who told me their stories out in the wastes with tears in their eyes. The sounds of battle and the screams of the suffering from so many went through my ears as the image before me in the present day showed me how real my imaginings truly were when I heard the pain in those sobs from the man now kneeling before the cross. The images slowly vanished into what I was looking at now, and the sufferings of that man 50 feet away continued to enter my ears, leaving me still with no idea what to do. Fortunately, nothing this day was really up to me. I blinked, and in an instant, I was kneeling beside the broken man on the steps. I placed my hand upon his back, feeling him shrink away either in pain or surprise before accepting my hand as his wailing steadied. I glanced back the way I had come, seeing my son right where I was before, and caught a glimpse of the large doors beginning to crack open beyond the archway. I turned back to the burned and broken man. He wiped his eyes between the bandages and collected himself. There, with a mind still flashing with pictures of each and every one of the terrible stories I'd heard growing up, and during my time in the Guard, my hand rested on his back, and I knew exactly what the man had gone through over so many years of running. I thought of the words I read and understood perfectly how far he tried to run just to end up right where he was supposed to be. There, I looked up from the broken runaway, and with my eyes on the cross above in the center, that stained glass, said to the man, "Welcome home." In an instant, I felt my hand leave his back as he stood himself up and climbed the remainder of the steps. I looked up at him standing before the podium, seeing that glass cross on the wall above as he slowly turned around. His eyes scanned the darkness and emptiness of the room before his eyes fell to me, and there he said straight to my face, the answer to that long overdue question. The blue in his eyes was bright between the bandages, almost as bright as the ones in my dream. And seeing this, he gave his confession that sounded like thunder as it echoed through the temple's halls.
I am Joshua Graham, the former legate of Caesar's Legion. I am a sinner.
He stood towering beneath the cross, almost as if he had been completely restored just by that admission. But the moment didn't last long, for the pain slowly returned, making him curl into himself as he stood, and another painful groan came from beneath the wrapping, without the echo of moments earlier. I turned towards the entrance, felt my son grab my leg, and shifting his focus between the burned man and the crowd of silent onlookers now entering through the archway. With my eyes on the crowd now pouring in and trying to figure out what was happening, I saw Joshua curl even further into himself at the returning pain out of the corner of my eye. I heard distant voices echo towards me from different places in the crowd saying, "Paul? Is that you? What did he say? My God, did he say his name was? It can't be him." The voices all became one indistinct sound that faded into the background of my own little world. I watched some of the people slowly step towards us, and despite everything happening around me, knowing who was behind me, And through all the chatter, the only thing I heard was when I felt the grip on my leg tighten and my son's voice came up from below. Why did that man need to come here so late? I knew my son meant late as in at night, but reflecting on all I heard of Joshua Graham over the years, now knowing all he went through and seeing firsthand what that road had done to him, I heard my boy's question as, why did he spend so long being wicked, survive the impossible, trek through the blistering heat for weeks or months, straight to a place he had no right to believe he would belong, and push himself through even more pain just to give his confession to a man he didn't know this night and in this holy place? Why did Joshua crawl his way to this place covered in burns after spending so much of his life in such a dark place? Watching the first man who left the crowd step up to Joshua Graham, I answered my son the answer to both questions. Because Christ is worth it. The world around me returned, and even though the chatter remained incoherent with more of my brothers and sisters entering the temple, I didn't need to hear anything else this night. The man before Joshua threw his arms around him while more people stepped forward to welcome him home, and Joshua endured the pain of every embrace gladly,